And we're back now with Bill Killen and Tom Henry, the filmmakers, chatting a little more about their wonderful documentary on Verplank Colvin. You had some familiar voices in this documentary. Now, people at home may say, that voice sounds familiar to me. Verplank Colvin was voiced by a well-known storyteller and outdoorsman, Willem Lange.
That's right.
From Vermont, who grew up in New York and was an Adirondack guide and a teacher in New York, and even a lumberjack, I think, at one point, before moving on, and of course a distinguished career at Vermont Public Radio, and he writes a column for newspapers around New England and New Hampshire Public Television now. He travels, and how appropriately does great outdoor stories. But he was the voice of Verplank Colvin.
Right.
Did you, right from the get-go, say, we need someone like Willem Lange to voice this role?
Yeah, the film for me was a kind of a way to get all the people that I really liked together, and so that I could meet them. But Willem Lange by far has the best voice, and to me anyway, I love his voice, and I thought no one else could be the voice of Colvin but Willem Lange. And kind of interestingly enough, when we were recording him in the studio, he said that he actually grew up just a few blocks from where Colvin lived. So that's kind of cool too.
In Albany.
In Albany, yeah. And then of course Dan Bergeron. He's the Adirondack folk singer, Dan Bergeron.
Yes.
And everyone knows his voice.
Our audience very familiar with Dan from our Songs to Keep documentary that we did a few years back on all the efforts by the folk singers to keep these Adirondack folk songs alive. And
yes.
so
right.
Dan was a big part of that, yes.
Yeah, and
so he was your narrator.
He was yeah.
Perfect.
He's the voice of the Adirondacks, so to speak, and coincidentally, he grew up with my mom, so that kind of helped. And I've known him for quite a few years, forever really. And we saw him. Tom and I were in Albany at the Adirondack Days in Albany at the museum, and he was there, and I told him I was doing this film, and he said, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." So then he said yes, so that was great. And Chris and Lisa, Tom's daughter, and her husband are professional musicians, so they recorded the Ballad of Blue Mountain Lake for the film, and then
which was really nice. That added such a nice character to the documentary, and the videography was beautiful, breathtaking.
Thank you. But yeah, the music. I think growing up watching Ken Burns on PBS, and then listening to interviews with him, he always mentions you have to get the music right. And to me, I'd gone through a lot of different traditional Adirondack songs when I was trying to find sort of a theme song for the film, and the Ballad of Blue Mountain Lake, to me, that just sounded right. And so they had a lot of fun with recording that. And what was the flugelhorn? I had never heard of a flugelhorn, but Chris was able to incorporate that into the credit version of that song. And then also I got, so when I asked Dan to narrate this, I just had a little boy, and who you wanted to ask me about. His name is
We
Colvin.
saw that in the credits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, his
Special
name is
thanks.
Colvin, oddly enough. And it took me 4 years to make the film, and he's 4.5 now, which is coincidental, I guess. So anyway, Dan knew I was having a son, and he gave me a compilation CD. It was called Goodnight Colvin, or something to that effect. And on there was this song by a musician by the name of Archie Fisher. And Archie Fisher, I didn't know who he was. I heard his voice, and I thought, "Is that you, Dan?" And he said, "No, that's." I looked at the credits, and that was Archie Fisher, and he is a really well-known Scottish folk singer. And so I, communicated with his agent, and finally got in touch with him. And I don't know, he's maybe in his 80s now, and he was more than willing to let me use the song, and that was a real fun. And so I was in Scotland a couple months ago. I got to meet him.
Fantastic.
And he actually plays over here in the Adirondacks a lot. He says it reminds him a lot of home. So all these pieces, all these people that I really admire and really love, I'd ask them if they would do it, and they say sure. So it was a lot of fun in that way.
And did it really give it an Adirondack character?
I like to think so.
I do too. I think the music gives the emotional impact. The Blue Mountain Lake theme is just so strong that that's still going around in my head, even without the lyrics. And then having Willem Lange's voice and doing the recording with Willem was just hysterical. He wouldn't sit down. He stood up for 3 hours, and had very few retakes. He knew how to pronounce all the Adirondack words. He had the enunciation, and he has this wonderful raspy voice. Great storyteller. But he would go off script a little bit, and he had this Adirondack connection. He worked in the logging camps, as you mentioned, Tom, as a young man, and he remembered, well, he would just break off. He remembered the two-holer outhouse in one of the logging camps. So here's this young guy working with these old fellas in this logging camp, and they have to go out and spend part of their morning in this outhouse. And he had this one story, sitting in there with a guy who was dropping his pants, and a dime fell out right down the hole. And he says, well, he scuffed around a little bit, and then he reached in his pocket and pulled out a $1 bill and threw that down in the hole. And Willem looked at him and said, what are you doing throwing $1 down there? And he said, well, I'm not going down there for a dime. So he'd have his stitches during this script, and then he'd go back on the message. And but it was
great storytellers do that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned you named your son.
Yep.
He's now 4.
4.5, yep.
For probably someday he'll thank you for choosing Colvin and not Verplank.
Right. Yeah. And actually, Chris and Lisa, Tom's daughter and son-in-law, they wrote a song about him. I don't know, because Colvin the Peak. So Colvin is the defender of the Great North Woods. That's the song they wrote about him. So he's got some, and they've nicknamed him Wolfjaw because Colvin as a peak name and nickname was just too common. Yes. So we've got Wolfjaw in there.
Yeah, Colvin didn't quite fit the legend. We're
Right.
ready for
Yeah,
Wolfjaw,
right. So.
We are chatting with Bill Killen and also Tom Henry, the filmmakers behind this great documentary, Colvin, Hero to the North Woods.